Hello, I'm Ernesto Panadero, and I'm going to be presenting teachers and peers as co-regulators via formative assessment, which is a presentation I just did in a conference in Cadiz for Early SIG number 1 and Early SIG number 4. This presentation was built up within a larger symposium. In the symposium, we discussed the social learning in terms of cell, co, and socially self-regulated learning in 3 different areas, according to the 3 different presentations that there were. The first one about MOOCs, the second one about challenge-based learning, and the third one about formative assessment, which is the one I did, in which I explore the role of teachers and peers as co-regulators. It's important to emphasize that I'm not going to be talking here about socially self-regulated learning, in which I have already worked a bit, but I'm going to be focusing on the regulation of learning and formative assessment. And the first thing that I want to mention is that I consider that assessment can still be innovative, because one of the problems that we found in classrooms across the world is that the assessment is not implemented in a formative way. And I believe that, with many others obviously, that if we do it in a formative way, which means aligning our learning goals with our assessment and using the information to increase the students' learning, but also the teachers' instructional design, then this is really innovative because it makes a difference in students' learning. The second thing I want to mention is this presentation is a theoretical one. I'm not going to be presenting a particular study, and the presentation has 3 main phases or blocks. The first one is about the state of the art in the relationship between regulation of learning and formative assessment, mechanisms through which the 2 of them influence the other, and tensions in the field. The first idea is, let's talk about state of the art. And from the first publications in the formative assessment area, the main authors were already talking about the importance of formative assessment for the self-regulation of learning. Some of the names that I'm showing at the screen at the moment are one of the most important authors in formative assessment, and they were mentioning this. 4 years ago, with Heidi Andrade and Susan Bruckard, we conducted a state-of-the-art review in which we analyzed theoretical and empirical reviews on the topic of formative assessment and self-regulation of learning. We identified 3 different phases. The first one being the early years, in which you can see some of the names that I just showed you in the previous slide. And in this phase, the relationship and the connection were still quite simple, so to speak. I will show you an example taken from Black and William. And as you can read here, the connections were there, but yet not very developed. Then we identified a second phase, which we call the middle years. You can identify some of the main models that we have in the field, such as Nicola McFarlane-Dick or Hattie and Timperley. And here we took one step forward because the connections were becoming more clearer. For example, if I show you Hattie and Timperley model, which is a model about how feedback works from a formative perspective, you can see that self-regulation is already included in the model in the bottom. So this was already a step forward. Finally, we identify what we call the present time, in which I personally think we still are under. And you can see that there is an increase on the numbers of reviews, and also those particular reviews are more specific. They aim for self-assessment or peer assessment or teacher feedback, etc. Here the models have become way much integrated, so that it's difficult to separate where self-regulation starts and where the formative assessment aspects are. For example, I'll show you my own model, which is the co-regulation via peer and teacher assessment. Here you can see that the integration is stronger and the connections are much deep. I will explain this model later on. I want to mention that based on the empirical findings from the review that Heidi and Susan and myself published, we extracted 4 main ideas. The first one is that the intersection between formative assessment and co-regulation deserved more empirical study. The second one is that the fusion between formative assessment and self-regulated learning has been mostly done by formative assessment scholars exploring the effects on SRL. The third one is that we were expecting a new generation of educational researchers that have been working on formative assessment and self-regulated learning from the start of their studies, and we hope, which is the fourth one, that this generation will actually move the field forward. And I want to reflect what is the current situation. After our review, the field has moved forward quite significantly. For example, 2 years back, Christian Brambock with some colleagues published a special issue on this topic in one of the key journals on assessment education. The discussion, the person who wrote the commentary was Jeff Frink, which is one of the most reputed self-regulated learning scholars in the field. Another thing that can show some ideas on how the field has developed is I took a look into my reference library and explored what were the main publications, empirical publications that I found for 2020 and 2021. And as you can see, there is already quite a huge number of them. What I want to emphasize is the one by Brockben, the third one, because they approach it from a different perspective, and that is they first explore the student's self-regulation profile and then investigate how this influenced formative assessment intake or how the students use the feedback they were receiving. So the conclusions that we can extract here is that we see a field that some decades ago was starting, and right now we are in a much stronger area in the field in which our connections have become much clearer and specific, and we can see huge amount of research incoming. Of course, as we still need more, but in comparison to the early years, there is a drastic change. Now, let me talk a little bit about how SRL and formative assessment are related. And let me mention about how good feedback practice, in other words, formative assessment, looks like. And I use the proposal by Nicola McFarlane-Dick from 2006. They propose that good feedback practice could take 7 different, principles or ideas. You can read through them. And this is how formative assessment could look like in a classroom. Again, this is just an example. There are many other ideas out there, but I think this is a good representation. Now, how does SRL looks like for those of you that are not familiar with the term? This is a very simple depiction of self-regulated learning. Most models agree that self-regulated learning self-regulation happens in 3 phases: plan and set goals, then monitoring how the student is going through the performance, and then reflect and adapt after finishing the task. And the cycle goes on and on because this is cyclic. Now, I want to show you something that shows how formative assessment can be quite close to self-regulation of learning. Here we have something called the assessment cycle. And here you have different ideas on how assessment can act as a regulated action in itself. So first, we will need to define the learning objectives, then select and design the learning activities, implement those assessment activities, gather the evidence, analyze and evaluate the evidence, identify the gaps, and make decisions based on that evidence. And then we might redefine the learning objectives. As you can see, both models look very much alike because there is a huge relationship between them. And here I want to emphasize the dual role of the self-regulated learning teachers, because at this point in the field, we are working on this idea that teachers should not only teach self-regulation to their students, but they have to be self-regulated themselves in a way to show to their students good models. Now, with 3 other colleagues back in 2019, we published a paper in which we incorporate 3 models on how formative assessment and self-regulated learning are related to each other. This is one. We took the model by Zimmerman, and we identify in the 3 different phases 6 ways in which formative assessment can make a difference in self-regulation. So, for example, if we go to the 4th phase, which will be the first one, if the students have a clear understanding of the standards, assessment criteria, they know they are going to be receiving feedback, they are in a positive classroom climate based on the way the teacher is handling the assessment, what we have is that the students are more precise and more strategic in how they plan the tasks and the type of motivational belief they perceive and activate. Then when they move into the performance phase when they have to monitor their progress, well, what happens is that they will be able to be more accurate with the progress because they have model to contrast with based on, for example, rubrics, or because they know that they are going to be receiving feedback from the teacher, etc. And by being more precise and accurate, they are able to establish other strategies when they face difficulties. Lastly, when they reach the self-reflection phase, by knowing how the good performance looks like, what type of criteria the teacher is applying, again asking for formative feedback, they are able to do more adaptive interpretations of their failures and identify their own strengths. And therefore, the cycle continues. Again, this is based on Zimmerman model. We also propose in the same paper another ideas based on this model. This model is by Butler and Winnie, and here you can see that it is more complex, it is more cognitive, or it has more cognitive elements than the one by Zimmerman. I'm not going to get into details here. You can always download the publication and read it there. And let me move on the last model that I want to show you. Based on co-regulation and socialized regulation of learning, but focusing especially on co-regulation, we developed this model. And here what we propose is that there is a co-regulation space. First, as you can see on the left part of your screen, the assessee performs a task. It could be a summary, it could be a presentation, it doesn't have to be something physical in itself. But here, let's imagine it is an essay. Then the assessor, which could be the teacher or the peer, by assessing that paper, they activate their own cycle of self-regulation. If you remember, I showed you a model on how formative assessment looks like, you know, the cycle. That is what is happening when the teacher and the peer are assessing this paper. Now, when they give the feedback to the learner, to the assessee, they generate this co-regulation space, the part in the middle. And there, by receiving external feedback coming from a teacher or of a peer, that leads to an interaction. That interaction, we propose that based on if it is deeper, if the interaction is deeper and more intense, then the assessee will have more opportunities for appropriation of the teacher or peer on regulatory strategies. Obviously, it is in this co-regulation space where we could take the good feedback practices that would be activated, such as the one by Nicola McFarlane did. That's actually when this could happen. But of course, also when the student is performing the task before, what will happen is that if we provide, for example, a rubric before they start the task, the student will have a clear understanding of the assessment criteria, the standards, and that will affect the performance of the task even before. So during this co-regulation space, what happens is the assessee, as you can see on the right corner of the model, the assessee will appropriate the peer and the teacher self-regulatory strategies and incorporate them to his own. So this is how we believe there is a connection between regulation of learning and formative assessment. The third block that I wanted to mention, this is about the tensions that need to get solved still in the field. And I want to mention four. So the first one is that the problem that we have in assessment literature is that the research is still quite traditional, and we need to change that. And one way that we can do this is by learning from SRL research, which has been using online measurement, eye tracking, physiological risk data, thinking about protocols for decades, really. So we can use that and start implementing it in assessment because it's going to make a difference. The second tension that I think we need to work on is that, especially coming from self and peer assessment, there is still a high level of papers with very poor research design and reports. You can find papers that do not even mention the age of the participant or the gender distribution, and then poor research design in which you have a descriptive study, so an intervention that is mixing, for example, rubrics, feedback, and exemplars. But by the end of that paper, the authors are claiming that the rubric have a positive effect on learning. But in reality, they cannot disentangle the effects because the intervention was fusing different aspects. I'm not saying that type of research is not important, of course it is, but it relates more to identifying good instructional practice than to clarify what are the specific aspects of different assessment tools. So the problem comes when the authors don't have this clear distinction in the paper, and then the report and the study is not strong enough. So I think we have to, and there is a large room for improvement in this area. The third one is that we need to better integrate SRL and formative assessment. The models that we have reached, I think, are quite interesting level of detail. It is not only the model that I have developed with colleagues, but for example, Heidi Andrade and Susan Brucker, they have their own model. There are other scholars that you can find in the special issue by Christian Brammo that I mentioned, for example, such as Linda Lal, that have really nice models that work on the integration of SRL and formative assessment. Now we have to bring this into empirical research. And of course, we need to continue developing new models if they are needed. And the fourth aspect or tension that I think we need to still get solved is that we still have most of the research coming from formative assessment scholars and exploring how formative assessment makes a difference in SRL. We have to look at it from a different perspective. And I want to point out again to the paper by Jacqueline Broadbent that I mentioned earlier, in which it could be interesting to analyze the profiles of the students from SRL and see how this applies to formative assessment. The uptake of feedback. Are, for example, better self-regulated learning able to enhance more difficult feedback than students who are worse at self-regulation? That would be a really nice study to conduct, and it's along the lines that Jacqueline was trying in his paper. With this, I will finish the presentation. Thank you for your attention. The papers that I saw that I co-authored, you can download them from my website, and you can follow me on Twitter if you feel like. And also, I will leave on my website the slides for this presentation. Thank you.